Good morning, ma'am. I'm Karan Malik, enrollment number 022, and my topic is Master Slave JK flip flops. So, starting with what is a flip flop? A flip flop is basically a circuit that is used to maintain a binary state as long as power is delivered to it until it is directed by another external input to change its state. So there are many different types of flip-flops, namely SR flip-flops, JK flip-flops, D flip-flops, T flip-flops. The major difference between these flip-flops is the amount of inputs that it receives and the manner in which it is affected by the inputs, the manner in which the output is affected by these inputs. It is the basic storage element in sequential logic, and flip-flops, along with latches, act as the fundamental building blocks of digital electronics and are used in computers, communication systems, and many other types of systems. So, the SR flip-flop was a great innovation in the field of sequential logic circuits, but it suffered from two switching problems. These problems are the set equal to 0 and reset equal to 0 conditions should not be used together and must always be avoided. And the second problem was if the set or reset changed the state while the enable input was still high, the correct latching action may not occur. Thus, to overcome these two fundamental design flaws and problems, the SR flip-flop design caused the JK flip-flop was developed. So, a JK flip-flop is the most widely used flip-flop of all the existing flip-flops and is considered to be universal. The operation and the sequential action of the JK flip-flop is exactly the same as that of the previously shown SR flip-flop, with the same set and reset inputs with the addition of a clock input. The difference this time is that the JK flip-flop has no invalid or forbidden input states like the SR latch did, even when S and R are both at logic 1 at logic high. So JK flip-flop is basically SR flip-flop with gates and additional clock input circuitry that prevents the illegal or invalid input conditions that occur only when the S and R are both equal to the logic high level 1. Due to this additional clocked input, a JK flip-flop has a total of four possible input combinations: the logic 1, the logic 0, the no change input condition, or the toggle and the toggle input condition. The symbol for JK flip-flop is very similar to that of an SR bistable latch except for the addition of a clock input. As it is visible on the diagram of the symbol of a JK flip-flop, it has five inputs, namely the J input, which is the set input, the K input, which is the reset input, the PR input, the CLR input, and the clock input, the CLK input. And it has two outputs, which are Q and the Q dash. The PR in the input stands for the preset, the CR stands for the clear. And the flip-flop is said to be set when it stores a binary 1 and it is said to reset when it stores a 0. And this is the symbol, the diagram and the truth table for JK flip-flop. As shown, there are four possible output states. Either there is no change in the memory, or the the JK flip-flop resets to 0, or it is set to 1, or the toggle action takes place. And there are two outputs, Q and Q dash, among which Q is the main output, which means that the binary bit which is stored in the Q output is treated as the primary output. And the Q dash output is always the opposite binary value of the bit that is stored in Q. So although the JK flip-flop acted as a huge improvement on the SR flip-flop, it still suffered from timing problems which were known as the race problems, and occurred if the output Q changed states before the timing pulse of the clock input could go off. To avoid this, the timing pulse period must be kept as short as possible, which means that it should have a very high frequency. This was sometimes not possible with the modern ICs, the integrated chips which are available. So the much improved master-slave JK flip-flop was developed to overcome this complication. A master-slave JK flip-flop A master slave JK flip-flop eliminates all the timing problems by using two flip-flops connected together in a series configuration. One flip-flop acts as the master circuit, which triggers on the leading edge of the clock pulse, while the other acts as a slave circuit, which triggers on the falling edge of the clock pulse, that is when the clock pulse is 0. This results in two sections, the master section and the slave section, both of them being enabled or activated during opposite half cycles of the clock signal. So the ICs which are used for the master slave JK flip-flops are the main IC which is used is the TTL74LS73. It is a dual JK flip-flop IC and contains two individual JK type bistables within a single chip. The other ICs which are used are the 74LS107, the 74LS109, and the 74LS112 ICs. So this is the circuit diagram of a master slave JK flip-flop. As shown, it has the same inputs as the normal or the basic JK flip-flop with the J input, the K input, and the clock input. The main difference or the main focal point of this diagram is that the clock input for the master latch and the clock input for the slave latch are always the complementary of each other. If the clock input for the master latch is 1, it means that slave latch, the clock input will always be the complement, that is 0. And the master latch and the slave latch are basically two flip-flops which are attached in a series configuration, giving the same two outputs Q and Q naught or Q dash, which are the opposite binary values of each other. So the input signals J and K are connected to the master flip-flop, which logs the input conditions while the clock input is high or at logic 1. As the input of the slave flip-flop is inverse due to the inverse clock input, the slave flip-flop does not toggle at this condition. The outputs from the master flip-flop are only seen by the gated slave flip-flop when the input falls and goes to the low logic or the logic level 0. And now when the clock is low, the outputs from the master flip-flop are latched, and any additional changes to its inputs are ignored because now it has a clock state of 0, thus it is deactivated. The gated slave flip-flop now responds to the state of its inputs passed over by the master section because now it has a clock input of 1 and thus the slave inputs gets activated in this half cycle. On the low to high transition of the clock pulse, the inputs of the master flip-flop are fed through to the gated inputs of the slave flip-flop, and vice versa. On the high to low transition, the same inputs are reflected on the output of the slave, making this type of flip-flop an edge or pulse triggered flip-flop. Then the circuit accepts the input data when the clock signal is high and passes the data to the output on the falling edge of the clock signal. In other words, the master-slave JK flip-flop is a synchronous device as it passes data only with the timing of a clock signal. So the symbol of a master-slave JK flip-flop is quite similar to that of a basic JK flip-flop. The main thing to notice is that just before the two outputs Q and Q dash, there is the presence of two gates, and the inputs are still the same, the J, K and the clock input, and the outputs also remain the same, the Q and Q naught, which are the binary opposites of each other. As shown in the timing diagram of the master slave flip flop, just below the symbol of the master slave flip flop, it clearly shows that the major dependence of the behavior that is exhibited by the master slave JK flip flop depends on the clock input. So in practical applications, many JK flip-flops, many master slave flip-flops are used together with the inputs of some flip-flops the output of some flip-flops acting as the inputs of the other flip-flops. We assume that the clock pulse inputs to all flip-flops are synchronized and occur at the same time to ensure their proper functionality. At the beginning of each clock pulse, some of the master elements change states, but all flip-flop outputs remain at their previous values. After the clock pulse returns to 0, some of the outputs change state, but none of the new states have effect on the master elements until the next clock pulse, because at this moment the clock pulse input to the master is 0. So the states of flip-flops in the system can be changed simultaneously even in the same clock pulse, and even after the outputs of flip-flops being connected to the inputs of other flip-flops. This becomes possible because a new state appears at the output terminals only after the clock pulse has returned to 0. Therefore, the content of one flip-flop can be transferred to a second flip-flop, and this occurs during the same clock pulse. And this is the diagram of the sequence of multiple master slave JK flip-flops that I just explained. So that's it. Thank you.